Opening. The brick in the heart of a snowstorm. There is a Cold War secret almost no one remembers. Not a missile, not a spy, not a classified blueprint tucked inside a general's briefcase. It was a brick. A small, heavy block of metal, so ordinary that if you saw it lying on a workshop floor, you'd probably kick it aside. Yet, in the deadliest winter storms of the Arctic, that simple brick often decided who lived and who never came home. Picture this. You're trapped in the far north, in a night so dark the sky feels like a ceiling. The wind claws across the ice. The temperature sinks to a level where exposed skin freezes in minutes. Your aircraft has just crash-landed. The radio flickers helplessly. Fuel is nearly gone. There is no fire, no electricity, no shelter. Inside the frozen fuselage, everything metal burns your fingers with cold. Most tools are useless. Batteries die, fuel thickens, matches shatter like glass. But buried deep in the survival kit is one object still intact, silent, solid, sealed. A metal block with no wires, no buttons, no moving parts. Cold War soldiers called it simply the heating brick. At first, it feels like a chunk of dead weight, but then, almost impossibly, you sense it warming, a gentle heat rising, then a steady glow of warmth spreading through your gloves, into your hands, into your chest, like someone just handed you back your life. No flame, no fuel, no oxygen needed, yet enough heat to keep a stranded soldier alive through a night that kills without mercy. This isn't legend. This happened again and again throughout the frost-bitten front lines of the Cold War. A war fought not only with ideologies and machines, but with the brutal, silent enemy called cold. And tonight, on Historia Prime, we uncover the ingenious heating brick Cold War soldiers relied on, yet almost no one ever knew existed. First, when the Cold War collided with real cold. The Cold War was not just a clash of ideologies, missiles and military doctrines. It was also a collision with something far more ancient, far more merciless. The cold itself. When NATO and the Warsaw Pact pushed their operations into the Arctic, into Siberia, into the far northern reaches of Canada, they stepped into a battlefield ruled by a silent, indifferent enemy. An enemy that didn't fire bullets, didn't negotiate, and didn't care who you were. It simply froze you. Out there, things we take for granted instantly turned into hazards. Matches snapped before they ever caught fire. Batteries drained to zero in a matter of hours. Liquid fuel thickened, then solidified inside its own container. Engines seized. Metal cracked. Human skin went numb and burned at the same time. From remote outposts to polar survey teams to pilots patrolling the icy edges of the world, everyone learned one universal truth. Without heat, every strategic plan is meaningless. You could carry the most advanced weapons, the finest machines, the sharpest intelligence, but if your body couldn't survive the cold, all of it might as well have been scrap metal scattered across frozen ground. And so, far from the sound of gunfire, far from the roar of bombers and submarines, another race quietly began. Not in missile silos, but in laboratories. Not led by generals, but by engineers. They were searching for a different kind of weapon. Not something to destroy, but something to preserve. A source of heat, simple, reliable, resistant to the failures of fire, fuel, and fragile technology. And the result of that search, after countless experiments and discarded prototypes, was condensed into a single, unassuming block of metal. A brick, as soldiers called it, small, silent, and strangely heavy in the hand. But inside it lived an entire philosophy of survival, a reminder that in the most unforgiving corners of the Cold War, victory didn't always belong to the nation with the biggest warhead. Sometimes it belonged to the side that could simply stay warm long enough to stay alive. 2. The secret inside the heat-making brick. If you sliced open one of these Cold War heating bricks, you wouldn't find wires, explosives, or hidden electronics. Inside is only a thick liquid, or sometimes a cloudy crystal block sealed inside metal. Ordinary, silent, almost disappointing, until you understand what it can do. This simple-looking material can store enormous heat, then release it on command, acting like a thermal battery decades ahead of its time. The secret is a phase-change material, a substance that hides energy when melting and returns it when freezing. The military's favorite was sodium acetate trihydrate, the same chemistry you now see in reusable hand warmers. Heat it past 58 degrees Celsius and it melts, quietly absorbing a huge amount of thermal energy. Then comes the remarkable part. Even as it cools, it chooses to remain liquid, like a sleeper agent waiting for a signal. That signal can be a bend in a small metal disc, a sharp tap, or even the touch of a crystal seed. And when it's triggered, the liquid snaps into crystallization and releases all the heat it stored. No smoke, no flame, just a smooth, steady warmth that lasts for hours, long enough to restore numb hands, protect a freezing chest, or make a sealed cockpit survivable again. The engineering is elegant. Unlike water, it doesn't expand when it solidifies, so the container never bursts. It can be reheated and reused over and over. And because it needs no oxygen, it works anywhere. Inside submarines, bunkers, aircraft cabins, or wind-battered tents where a flame would be dangerous or impossible. It isn't just a gadget. It's a quiet masterpiece of survival. Science simple, reliable, and powerful in the one moment that matters most, when the cold is trying to take your life. Third, missions that could not fail, and the brick no one noticed. In the lesser-known archives of the Cold War, traces of this device appear again and again. Arctic patrol pilots carried several heating bricks in their survival kits, knowing that one forced landing on the ice could turn a routine mission into a fight against time. Small military teams, guarding frozen outposts, used them to keep engines from freezing solid overnight, because an immobilized vehicle in the Arctic wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. There were missions where failure didn't just mean losing a soldier, it meant losing intelligence, losing momentum, losing a fragile advantage. During reconnaissance operations, rolls of black and white film and delicate measuring instruments became just as vulnerable as human skin. One drop in temperature, one moment of freezing, and months of data could be ruined forever. And there, hidden among compasses, rations, and tools, the silent brick took on the responsibility no other device could shoulder, protecting the things that were not allowed to fail. Across the ice, Soviet research stations on the drifting Arctic pack faced winters where resupply vanished for months. Machines needed to run, labs needed to operate, people needed to sleep, eat, measure, record, and survive, all while the cold outside waited like a patient assassin. In those stations, the heating brick wasn't a secret weapon. It was a lifeline, a quiet foundation that kept every other system from collapsing. And perhaps the strangest irony is this: in movies and history books, we remember the glamorous symbols of the Cold War. Spies slipping through shadows, bombers crossing borders, nuclear submarines prowling beneath the ice. Yet almost no one remembers the unremarkable metal blocks that kept thousands of fingers from dying, kept fragile film from snapping apart, and kept soldiers alive long enough to complete missions that never made the headlines. It wasn't heroic, it wasn't dramatic, but it worked. And in the Arctic, that was everything. Fourth, when a military secret entered everyday life. One of the most unexpected chapters in this story began just as the Cold War slowly cooled, but winter did not. Across Eastern Europe in the 1970s, heating fuel was never guaranteed. Fireplaces burned weekly, coal was scarce, electricity flickered in and out like a tired heartbeat. Yet the cold never negotiated. It simply arrived, as ruthless as ever. And so, the military's quiet invention slipped into civilian life. heating bricks, once reserved for pilots and Arctic patrols, began appearing in ordinary homes. Families would boil the metal blocks in large pots, letting the phase-change material inside drink in as much heat as it could hold. Then they wrapped the bricks in thick cloth, tucked them under bed covers, slipped them beneath coats, or carried them on long train rides through frozen countryside. One brick brought warmth for hours. A few bricks, used in rotation, could stretch comfort through the longest winter nights. Compared to traditional hot water bottles, these civilian bricks were safer and sturdier. They didn't burst. They didn't leak scalding water. They didn't crack with age or sudden temperature changes. In tiny rooms lit by dim bulbs, a single silent brick under a blanket could mean more than physical warmth. It could soften the quiet anxiety of living through a winter of shortages. From the outside, it all seemed like a small technical convenience. But for families struggling to endure months of cold, this little block of metal often marked the difference between a night merely survived and a night genuinely slept. It was no longer a military secret. It was simply human survival, shared quietly, passed from hand to hand. 5. From Cold War battlefields to the warmer hands you hold today. If you've ever bought a reusable hand warmer, the kind that heats up the moment you bend a small metal disc, you've already held the direct descendant of a technology once tied to drifting ice stations, Arctic air patrols, and missions so secret they never made it into any book. What was once invented for soldiers facing the deadliest cold on Earth has quietly slipped into everyday life. And the principle hasn't changed at all. You heat the pack in boiling water, letting it absorb energy as its crystals melt. You let it cool while staying liquid, like a silent thermal battery waiting for your command. When you need it, you snap the metal disc, and crystallization rushes through the pack, releasing hours of steady warmth. When it cools again, you simply reheat it and repeat the cycle, dozens, even hundreds of times. Today, people tuck these warmers into sleeping bags on camping trips, slip them inside boots, press them against their stomachs on long winter nights, or keep them in jacket pockets during icy commutes. A few of these modern bricks in a winter survival kit aren't just convenient. They can be a quiet insurance policy against the cold moments you hope never come. And what's worth pausing on, what's worth truly considering, is this. Many of us are using a piece of technology born from some of the tensest, coldest moments in human history, without ever realizing that the same principle once kept pilots alive, protected priceless reconnaissance data, and held back death on nights when even steel froze. What once saved lives in silence now warms hands in the ordinary world, and most of us never think twice about it. 6th, conclusion. One brick, one philosophy of survival. The story of the Cold War heating brick leaves us with a quiet truth. History is often told through the names of leaders, treaties, and missile crises. Yet the real lives on the front lines were shaped by things small enough to fit in a pocket. While the world fixated on nuclear standoffs and espionage, survival often depended on an object that couldn't explode, couldn't fire, and carried no symbol of power. A simple brick, silent, unremarkable, invisible to grand strategy, kept soldiers alive long enough to finish their mission, brought pilots through nights that would have frozen them solid, and allowed scientists on drifting ice stations to keep gathering the data the world depended on. It wasn't heroic in appearance, but it was heroic in purpose. And perhaps the greatest legacy of this heating brick is not the technology itself, but the perspective it gives us. It reminds us that survival doesn't always come from the loudest or most complex invention. Sometimes it comes from the simplest expressions of science ideas that are humble, reliable, and profoundly human. It reminds us that behind every tense border and every Cold War headline were people fighting for the most basic needs. A warm meal, a few hours of sleep, a night without the cold clawing at their bones. And it reminds us that in our modern, unstable world, tools that require no electricity, no fuel, and no infrastructure, tools as simple as a heat brick may deserve more attention than we give them. Because when we look back on the Cold War, we tend to remember the noise, the missiles, the threats, the shadows. But if you listen closely, beyond the wind screaming over Arctic ice and the engines struggling against the cold, there is another sound entirely. A faint, steady warmth coming from an unremarkable block of metal. A small thing, a quiet thing, yet it granted human beings something they could never afford to lose: time to survive, time to think, and time to continue writing the next chapter of their own story. And sometimes, that is the greatest victory of all.